They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
We don't need to go populist left or populist right. We don't need to embrace neo-Marxism or neo-fascism, these disastrous movements from the 20th century. Turns out the answer is pretty much our Bill of Rights, our story. Embrace freedom. That's the answer.
And if the LP has a purpose, it's not to put people to sleep. It's to wake them up.
We're here because we love liberty, and we're here because we hate injustice. We are here to save mankind. We are here to fight.
Join us, the Libertarian Party, in perhaps the most exciting, grandest endeavor in history, the restoration of American liberty.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Hello and welcome to episode 74 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris and I'm your host. My guest today is Tim Moen. He's my second favorite Canadian after Cincinnati Reds first baseman Joey Votto, who is from the Toronto area. Tim, you may remember, was very recently the leader of the Libertarian Party in Canada. He was a candidate for Prime Minister a few years ago. I think not the last election they had, but the previous parliamentary election they had in Canada. He traveled the country advocating for the Libertarian Party and spreading the libertarian message, and did a really good job of it in a way that I think appealed to Canadians. He had varied success with it. Of course, Canada is what it is. The reliance on socialism and socialized healthcare and sort of the Canadian way of looking at things is an impediment to certain aspects of the liberty message. But Tim has always been a very good advocate for that in a way that I think the average Canadian would be more likely to respond than maybe a Ron Paul type more American style message rooted in kind of the things that our country says it values a little more. So when the trucker protest back in February happened in Canada, right when it was heating up, I was like, oh, I need to have Tim here on Decentralized Revolution to talk about it. And it took 2 or 3 days to set up to get a time where we could both do it. And then by the time the interview here was recorded and getting ready to post, I had kind of a logjam of a few episodes there, and I was going to make this, I think, episode 72. And then the Russia-Ukraine thing happened, and kind of the trucker protest kind of came to a point where it wasn't, front page news anymore, and there wasn't new developments, and it wasn't what people were talking about every day. So I kind of went back to my original schedule of release. So I apologize to Tim and to you guys for the fact that this isn't exactly the most timely episode. But I think it is still a very good one to listen to about how to communicate liberty, but also kind of what we have, some of the things we've learned here in North America about government and about what we're up against here over the last 2 years of the virus panic, as I like to call it, and the attendant actions by the regime that have limited our freedoms, and just kind of the way in which, when pressed, the government will respond when you challenge their right to control things in the name of an emergency. So I think a lot of what we talk about in regard to how the Trudeau government responded to the trucker protest is, although not exactly front page as it happens news, I think it's a very valuable discussion to have. And so I'm happy to present this talk with Tim Moen. Hey, Tim, it's good to talk to you again. It's been more than a year. And at that time, I said, hey, if there's anything ever happens up in Canada that we need to talk to you about, I'll give you a ring. So is there anything going on in Canada?
Yeah, man. Wow. It's just a nonstop onslaught. I mean, the latest thing is people pounding the drums of war in Ukraine right now. But yeah, I mean, I'm guessing the big news is the pushback, the kind of populist uprising of trucker convoy that spread worldwide now. It sounds like there's one happening in the States. And yeah, we had a lot of controversy. Our prime minister did a lot of unpopular things in response to the protests that were going on. And so, yeah, I guess you could say there's some things going on.
It's been a big topic of conversation down here, and not just among other libertarians. I mean, to the extent that I think it's been covered a little bit in the corporate media, but normally we don't hear much from Canada at all. And I'm actually pleasantly surprised, but when I think about it, not really surprised that something like this would come from Canada. I think the textbook, the first thing we think of when we think of Canada is basically like Toronto, right? The comedians that have come out of Toronto, and the big sport, the Blue Jays and the Maple Leafs and stuff like that. But Canada is a much bigger place than just Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal. And the West, talk about what you're in Alberta, so the difference in the different regions of Canada and maybe how they will look at the COVID-19 thing. How has that all been playing out?
Well, I suspect, I was as surprised as you are that there was this great pushback, pleasantly surprised, because I'd kind of written off Canadians in a lot of ways. I've written off my countrymen. It's very hard to get anywhere with the message of liberty here in Canada. And part of that is because there's so much noise on the political stage. It's very easy to start a political party and to get on the ballot and different things like that. So we're cutting through other parties like the People's Party of Canada and the Constitutionalist Party and all these different parties that have kind of overlapping messages to us. So it's difficult to kind of cut through that noise. But also Canadians are generally kind of just go along to get along. The stereotype of us being polite and non-confrontational is kind of right. It's a stereotype for a reason. And most of us have gone along to get along these past years. There's a few notable exceptions. I've been pushing back pretty hard. Maxime Bernier, a few other politicians maybe have a little bit, but for the most part, it's been kind of people on the margins that have been pushing back, and not a very popular opinion. Most people just kind of go along with the establishment narrative. So I was pleasantly surprised to see how popular and how well supported this trucker convoy was. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there's the big cities, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, but Canada's a big place, and there's a lot of people and a lot of places in between those big cities. And they, the divide here in Canada, it would be very similar to what you'd see in the States between kind of the urban and rural constituents, right? I mean, if there's a large rural population, by and large, we just kind of go along to get along. But we don't see much government, and we don't see much need for government. We're kind of self-reliant. I mean, we live in very inhospitable climate, and we're used to relying on ourselves and our neighbors and kind of our local communities to get by in rural areas, whereas in the urban areas, it's much more progressive and integrated. So we just reached our breaking point. I just saw rural people, and not even rural people, but some people in urban areas just kind of say this is enough, right? And mostly blue collar people whose lives have been affected. And so I was pleasantly surprised to see this upbringing and these people push back hard, and it had some positive results too. Right away in Saskatchewan, for example, Premier Scott Moe directly addressed the truckers and said, I've heard you, and I'm going to do something about this, and I'm going to repeal the vax passport and all these restrictions. Shortly after that opened the door then for Jason Kenney, the premier of my province, to say, yeah, we're putting a hard end date. Actually, as of 2 days from now, the vax passport's gone, and by the end of March, or by the end of February, masks will be gone as a provincial mandate as well. So things are almost back to normal in the province of Alberta. And that's, again, in large part thanks to the truckers. And we're now seeing this across Canada. We're seeing public sentiment has shifted. Shortly before the trucker convoy, public sentiment favored these kind of draconian lockdowns and public health measures. Now it's 60% opposed.
Wow.
So we've shifted the balance of the narrative here, which also kind of surprised me because the media went, guns blazing, trying to paint these people and with the help of the prime minister labeling all the truckers as misogynistic, anti-science, anti-vax nutters who are kind of the enemy of the people who shall not be tolerated. The media, Trump, amplified that narrative, tried to say these truckers were harming the economy, that there was terrorists in their group, that there was Nazis in their group,
right.
That Confederate flag flying people. And these truckers, I'm so proud of them. They stayed nonviolent. This didn't degenerate into what you saw down south with the BLM rallies and the Antifa rallies. Yep. They held themselves up with dignity. They honked their horns. They were very inconvenient and annoying to the ruling elite of this country, but they did not act in violence, and they self-policed. That Nazi flag lasted maybe 10, 15 minutes. There was one Confederate flag. Again, that guy was run off within half an hour of showing up there. These truckers have no time for bigotry or any of that stuff. Yeah. They're well aware of how the media and how COINTELPRO and agent provocateurs are going to try to paint them in a bad light. And they were well organized and well prepared to maintain their dignity and be civilly disobedient in a way that helped Canadians sympathize with their cause when all these odds were stacked against them. And I'm very happy about that.
I want to break that down a little bit. You mentioned the term that Trudeau and others tried to portray the truckers as misogynistic. We haven't got that against the anti-vax crowd in the U.S. much. It's sometimes, we're racist or whatever. Those people are called racist, but I'm curious to was there any logic to that? Or is that just is that a pretty common thing in Canada for the bad people who don't like the government to be called that?
Right. Well, look, we consume a lot of American media up here. And so, the establishment narrative is very similar to that, what you see in the US, in that anyone, slightly right of center is branded, an extremist, extreme right, misogynistic, white supremacist. We get all that up here as well. It didn't help that we saw a swastika flying at the very start of the protests in Ottawa. Now, that came from a very suspicious place. It came from Chateau Laurier, which is a hotel that hosts the RCMP and all these government officials. And so there's a lot of speculation about whether this was actually a protester or an RCMP member. They went with an entourage of people, and one of the photographer actually looked strikingly similar to the prime minister's personal photographer. So there's a professional photographer following these guys. They stayed away from the main protest area and stayed on the wings where there weren't very many people, because they likely knew that had they gone into the main protest area, they would have been ushered out very quickly on their asses. And so they got their photo op. They created a talking point that Trudeau was able to associate white supremacy and Nazism with these protests, but it still didn't work. Canadians saw right through it. Sorry, I can't hear you there. I think you're muted. Still muted there, my man. Yeah, the Nazi flag and the Confederate flag, they both appeared at roughly the same time. Both the bearers of these flags were different than the rest of the protesters in that they were fully masked. You couldn't identify them at all. Everyone else had their face naked and they were raw dog in the air, so to speak. But these guys were fully masked. You couldn't see their identity. And in fact, conservative alternative media put a bounty on any information leading to their identities, and they think they got the bounty up to about $10,000, and no one could identify who these people were. So it was very suspicious. Yeah, I can't hear you. On my side, it shows that you are muted. So I don't know if you've clicked mute or. There we go.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. I think what happened is I hit the cord and then it muted it down here. So
Okay.
I can pick that up because it was right after the you were talking about the probably fake flag, literally a false flag.
Yeah.
Situation. Okay, so I'll just ask a question. I was going to follow up on that. So there's literally what is actually literally almost a false flag operation with the Nazi flag. They wanted to get the backdrop, but they didn't go in. So you mentioned COINTELPRO. Of course, that was the famous, many years the FBI did that here in the States.
Yeah.
And it still goes on. I mean, if you look at the January 6th stuff, it does, again, you don't think of Canada as being a place where that kind of stuff could happen. So is the RCMP kind of your equivalent to the FBI? And has this happened before?
Yeah, definitely. RCMP and CSIS have both been known to pull this kind of stuff in the past. I'm trying to remember the name of the couple. There was a couple that were kind of borderline. I mean, I think they were developmentally disabled to some degree, and I can't remember whether it was undercover CSIS agents, which is our version of this, I guess the CIA, or it's our intelligence agency that looks, or whether it was the RCMP. But they had an undercover agent basically provoke and encourage these two developmentally disabled individuals to do a terrorist plot, and then they arrested them. We've seen this before. Actually, the last time, I'm sure we'll talk about the Emergency Act that Trudeau enacted. That is a predecessor or a successor of the War Measures Act, which it has much of the same powers, and it just has a nicer name put on it, right? It's no longer the Department of War, it's the Department of Defense, that sort of thing. So now it's called the Emergencies Act. But the last time it was used was by his father, and it was the War Measures Act when there was terrorist bombings. There was a terrorist group called the FLQ ongoing here, and there was actually an RCMP member that was involved with some of these bombings, and he said some strange things in court about how the bombing that he did wasn't even the worst thing he did for the RCMP. Wow. He was dismissed, charges were dismissed and everything. So even at that time, there was a lot of controversy about the War Measures Act back in the early 70s. And there was, suspicious things going on with the RCMP. And then a few years ago, maybe it was about a decade ago now or longer, we had a G8 summit in Toronto. Yep. And it was pretty clear that there were agent provocateurs in those protests that started a riot, started breaking windows, burning cop cars, and gave cover and gave excuse, I guess, for the authorities to crack down on the protests and use force. So these are things that occur here. It's a law enforcement tool here, just as it is in the US, and there's lots of examples of it being used.
I would imagine people from up in Canada come down to Quantico to get trained in Virginia by that's where the FBI trains people.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all. Wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. So let's talk about how did when this thing first started, they announced the convoy. It was kind of seemed like a joke. Then it kind of started to happen. And then Trudeau was like, oh, it's fringe, right? So was there any effort to lobby at the provincial level? Or was this kind of a spontaneous thing saying, hey, none of our politicians are standing up for us here? It's precipitated by it was the vaccine requirement to cross the border, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's what precipitated it. So it started as that. It was like there's going to be a good chunk of truckers that were not going to be able to do their job anymore because of the federal mandate that required vaccine passports, vaccination to cross the border. And that got a lot of truckers angry, and they organized, and then more people piled on with their own grievances, with what was going on in the provinces, with what was going on, in other jurisdictions. And so it just became a general movement against all these mandates that all governments at different levels kind of brought in against the people. But yeah, it was started initially because of the cross-border mandate that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals brought in, and it kind of snowballed from there. And you're right, they tried to minimize and disparage it, say, oh, it's just a handful, it's just a few dozen, there's no way that many trucks could be involved. I saw one guy say, said, I did the math and it would stretch from like Winnipeg to Vancouver if there were that many trucks. Well, I did the math, and yeah, if you had trailers on every truck, and if you had like several trucks following distance between every truck, it might. But most of these trucks, first of all, they were double, triple, quadruple laned. They weren't carrying trailers. And so there was a lot more than they were letting on. And it grew into a huge thing. And I think, frankly, it scared the political class. I mean, they were right downtown in Ottawa. And I think that scared them more than some of the things they were doing. They were doing some things, allegedly, with these convoys that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, like shutting down traffic and cross-border traffic and doing blockades and different things like that. But I don't think that was really the impetus for the draconian measures that the government used. I think it was the fact that they were honking right in front of Trudeau's office where he wanted to work. And I don't think he felt safe there. And I think it really rattled him and a lot of his the intelligentsia around him. And I think that's why they brought in this emergency act, which is, unprecedented.
And he actually supposedly came to the States, or was not seen in public for a few days, or after again, he said, minimized it. Then all of a sudden he's gone, or there was a cover story he had COVID, or what happened there, I guess.
Yeah. Well, as soon as the weekend the convoy arrived in Ottawa, Justin Trudeau tested positive for COVID. And so his vaccines didn't work, and he disappeared off the map. No one knows where he was. There was some rumors that he was in Tofino, BC, which is on the furthest West Coast community. It's kind of like a little hippie surfing community on Vancouver Island. Because he quite often goes there for a little rest and relaxation. No one really knows where he was, but they ushered him away to a secret location, bunkered him down. And, these truckers were basically, their main objective was to have a conversation with Trudeau, have a conversation with these politicians and get some answers. And I suspect had Trudeau come out and face the crowd, it would have been peaceful. He would have been asked some tough questions. He might have got some jeers. He might have met some organizers, and these trucks might have moved on when they heard what he had to say. But he didn't have the balls to show his face in town.
Well, I think that is kind of. I think it's a feature everywhere of politicians, all the way down, from the presidency and prime ministers all the way down to like school boards and stuff, is that they do these things that affect people's lives in a big way. And then when people show up and are at the, angry at all or disagree forcefully at all, then they're immediately labeled as something or other. And I think that's just, it just shows you the type of person who's doing this. They think they have the right to do this to other people. And I think they get away with most of it. And they're not personally brave people, and 98% of them. And then it's just amazing how they wilt. And so I think it's great that we're going to have to do more of that. People in the States here are doing that over, school board issues and stuff, to the extent where, our FBI has been instructed to make sure they're not terrorists or whatever. And so in Canada, so did they have did they have like a leadership of the convoy and saying, hey, can we go sit down somewhere? Was there any sort of organized, hey, let's come to the table and talk to us about this?
Yeah, there was a number of leaders. I think the convoy had a committee, and they had, Tamara Leach was one of them. They had, I think Chris Barber was another one. They had this other guy, Pat King, who's a bit of a polarizing figure here in Canada that, Rebel News thinks he might actually be a Fed because he does a lot of things that seem to discredit the movement. They kind of liken him to the guy at the Capitol riot or Capitol protest or riot or whatever you want to call it, who initially opened the door and let everyone in, and it's suspected that he might have been working with the FBI. So it seems like there are people maybe embedded in leadership and in different places in this movement that might be there to discredit the movement. Whether they're there purposely to do that, or whether it's just that they're, maybe these kind of movements quite often attract very marginal people who don't necessarily have the best social skills, and so maybe that's just the explanation. But at any rate, yeah, these leaders in this committee were having regular press conferences. There was a Métis, I think Tamara Leach is a Métis woman, and early on in the protests, the biggest complaint from progressives was that these protesters weren't treated as badly as pipeline protesters and environmentalists in Canada. And so I thought it was ironic that one of the first victims of police violence we saw was a full-blooded Mohawk lady, disabled, getting trampled by a police horse. So the progressives got exactly what they wanted, which was police brutality. I mean, they were crying that there wasn't enough police brutality. There was all sorts of things like that. Now, the one thing that I do that was really troubling, I guess, out of this was the enactment of the Emergencies Act. And when the Emergencies Act came in, that allowed authorities to freeze bank assets of people that were suspected of supporting these truckers. So if you donated, $20 to them, you could have your bank accounts frozen. The Ottawa police chief said very chilling things like, this is not over. Like, we will be actively trying to identify people, and you will face financial and criminal repercussions of your activities. And what were these people doing? Well, they were protesting and honking in downtown Ottawa. That was the criminal activity that they were doing, and it was made criminal by the Emergencies Act. And maybe, there was some local bylaws that made it criminal and mischief or something like that. But from a libertarian perspective, these were peaceful people, maybe creating a bit too much noise, but that's the extent of it. And so they're talking about, it's not enough that we removed your livelihood over this past 2 years. Yep. It's not enough that we cracked your skulls, pepper sprayed you, stomped you, batoned you to break up your peaceful protest. We're now going to go after you and make sure your destruction is fully completed by spending all these tax dollars and police resources tracking you down afterwards and destroying you. Now, when the Emergency Act kicked in and we started hearing about protesters whose bank accounts were frozen, whose assets were frozen, Druthers News, which is an alternative news outlet here in Canada, had their account frozen, so they couldn't access it and do business. All these things started happening. People started panicking, trying to get their money out of accounts. ATMs were empty of cash. And at the same time, Canada's 5 largest banks went offline. You couldn't do any online banking for about 24 hours at Canada's 5 largest banks. So we don't know whether that was because of a bank run, because they were trying to insure against a bank run, or whether it was just banks putting in place the infrastructure needed to freeze accounts. Who knows what it was, but very troubling to see the kind of things that the government could do to peaceful protesters who they brand terrorists. And that has had the opposite effect, I think, that the authorities want. I think Trudeau wanted to project that I'm in control, I have authority, I'll do whatever is necessary to maintain peace and order. But what he did instead is panicked all Canadians into, like, are my assets safe? Should I pull them out of the bank right now, lest I be branded an enemy of the state and have all my assets frozen? Then we saw, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Trudeau all of a sudden, out of nowhere, lift the Emergencies Act.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple of speculative reasons why that may have happened. One is that the act was going to a vote in the Senate. Canada has a Senate. It's kind of our sober second look, and it's primarily owned by Trudeau. I mean, it's full of liberals, and so he should have no problem getting it. But what we were hearing rumors that a lot of these liberal senators were troubled by aspects of the Emergency Act, primarily the financial and banking aspects. They thought, some of them thought that was a bridge too far. So we suspect Trudeau, one theory is that Trudeau lifted the act to avoid an embarrassing defeat in the Senate by his own people. So it was a way of saving face. Another theory is that he was told by, look, this enactment of the Emergencies Act undermined the public's trust in central banks. Yeah. And so there's good reason to believe that some central bankers and financial sector big players might have got a hold of Trudeau and said, look, you're going to throw this whole banking system into disarray and undermine the public's trust in us, and you're going to ruin us financially if you don't get rid of this Emergency Act. So it's been a roller coaster ride, to say the least, over the last week or two.
Yeah, I want to get into a little bit more of the fallout and where we are now. We're recording this on Thursday, February 24th. But regarding protests and things like that, theoretically, we have in the States, we have the First Amendment guaranteeing a right to, free speech, peaceable assembly, petition the government, redress of grievances. What's the constitutional and traditional sort of framework for that in Canada?
Yeah, well, we have no First Amendment, right? In fact, Tamara Leach's husband talked about how the government is infringing his First Amendment right. And that just shows you how intertwined Canadian constituents are with the U.S., where they can't even differentiate what's a U.S. Constitution versus a Canada Constitution. But we have no enshrined First Amendment here in Canada. We have a Charter of Rights, and it talks about freedom of speech and expression in there, and a bunch of other freedoms. However, it's all has the first clause in that Charter of Rights is a notwithstanding clause. So you have all these rights, notwithstanding some sort of emergency or public. I can't remember how it's worded, but basically, if it's in the public good to suspend these rights, then you can suspend these rights if necessary. So it's basically a worthless scrap of paper here in Canada. And, we knew this because, over the last decade or two in Canada, we've seen comedians get fined by human rights tribunals for making jokes. And we've seen what amounts to compelled speech in universities and different things. And this is why Jordan Peterson is so popular right now, because he was very vocally opposed to these kind of compelled speech laws. So we definitely don't have anything that approaches a First Amendment here in Canada.
So I've also heard, and am I right, that some like pastors and things like that have had some, yeah. So I didn't hear about the comedians, but like that's pretty. Both of those are pretty chilling.
Yeah.
To think that, in a liberal democracy, it's supposed to be all about plurality of views and public discourse, and like religion is a big part of that, and like comedians are a huge part of that. They should be the ones that are teasing out these ideas on the edge of things, and if those two classes of people can't talk, then what's next, right? It's amazing.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, the comedian. One example of a comedian getting fined was a comedian in Vancouver who was trying to deal with a couple, a same-sex couple that was heckling him, and he made a joke about lesbians or something like that. They took great offense, took him a human rights tribunal, and won. And a human rights tribunal is a provincial tribunal. It's kind of extrajudicial. It doesn't follow the same process as a court, and it's in theory designed to have dispute resolution that doesn't take up court resources, but it doesn't follow. It doesn't have the same evidentiary standards. It doesn't have the same due process or right of, what's it called? Going further and appealing. It does. You don't have the right to appeal and different things like that. So it's a much lower standard of justice, and so they can basically just make all sorts of arbitrary rulings. There was another case of a comedian in Montreal who made a joke about a Make-A-Wish Foundation kid, and he was joking about he wanted to get his money back because the kid got better and didn't need his Make-A-Wish anymore or something like that. Well, the kid's family took great offense to that, and they won his.
Now that's a funny joke, but wouldn't you be happy that your kid?
Right.
To me, I'd be like, "F that guy, my kid's alive," and that's the important thing. But my goodness.
And one of the famous cases that brought this all to light was Ezra Levant, who is now the founder and kind of the head honcho of Rebel Media. Back in 2007, he ran a magazine called The Western Standard in Canada. And at the time, we had those two Danish cartoonists get murdered by Islamist extremists for printing a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. And Western media refused to show that cartoon for fear of offending. While he courageously reprinted that cartoon in the Western Standard and was taken to court by an imam in Calgary and to the Human Rights Tribunal, and he spent $250,000 defending himself. Now he managed to win, but most people don't have the kind of resources Ezra had. And so we've seen these human rights tribunals oppress pastors. For example, a pastor said something deemed homophobic in his church, and the Human Rights Tribunal banned him from using email without supervision and fined him and did like all sorts of crazy things. And now, yes, you're right. We bring it forward to present day where we have pastors getting locked up because of holding church services and not following COVID restrictions and different things like that. And then, I think our most famous pastor is Pastor Arthur Pawlowski in Calgary, who ran the Nazis out of his church. You might remember that viral video clip. Well, because of the trouble he's been in with the court, he's basically under a gag order. He's not allowed to speak out against the COVID regime or attend speaking events, or I don't even know if he's allowed to preach right now, but he's continually getting arrested because he continually speaks out against this regime. So there are a lot of churches that are feeling under the gun because of a lot of this stuff.
That's amazing. Michael Malice has been saying something over the last year or so about he's encouraged that conservatives, what we would also call down here people in red states, are starting to see that police will come in and crack their heads if they break the law, and they'll close down their church, they'll close down their business if they're if they ever pass a big gun control thing. Because a lot of people down here will say, oh well, my cousin's a deputy and he's for the Second Amendment, so we don't have to worry about them passing that law because they're not going to come get our guns. And so Michael Malice is saying he has enjoyed seeing conservatives wake up to the fact that the cops will come and do it to you, even though you're a Republican and you're white and you're a homeowner, and that they will come if they're instructed to. 80% of them at least will come and follow that order. So was there any among the sort of people who would have supported the trucker convoy? Are we seeing that type of thing where are they typically the thin blue line people as well as the don't tread on me people, but now are they, based on what the police actually did to the protesters, like are they starting to wake up? Is the general public changing their attitude toward law enforcement?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a huge red pill moment, really the past 2 years, but for sure the convoy, it's been a red pill moment in terms of police for a lot of conservatives and back the blue type people who, see police in a different light now. And even, just before this podcast, but just before this interview, I got a call from a guy who's conservative and I tweeted something out this morning about this Ukraine-Russia crisis, talking about how everyone is using this language like we have to do something. Just reminder that the people that use we are always talking about people other than themselves that they want to go kill and die, essentially for the military industrial complex. And, normally those opinions just kill other people, but now nukes are in play. And so be careful what you opine for, people. And I'm getting all sorts of support, and this guy is a conservative and would have been all over, let's invade Iraq and Afghanistan and do all these things. And he does not trust the establishment one bit. And a lot of people don't. And he's like, fuck that. We're not going, I would never go to war in Ukraine. I won't support that. This is all a power grab by the power elite. And people are seeing through all this stuff, right? They're losing their grasp on the narrative and on their power, therefore. And so I think, we're going to see a ratcheting up of rhetoric, a ratcheting up of power, of authoritarianism. And, hopefully people see right through it, and we see the great reset that you and I might like to see, rather than Klaus Schwab kind of thing.
I think it is pretty interesting that even, you're starting to see in the corporate media and, places like the CDC and things like that start over the past few weeks. They've been kind of walking back some stuff and saying the science is, masks are not really effective, and we can stop doing this. And, they're kind of, you can see they're kind of trying to figure out a way to gracefully transition out of the COVID stuff. And I remember my sister asked me a few months ago, they live in Ohio and they wanted to go down to Florida for to see Disney World. And she was like, do you think they're going to this was, like I say, this was 6 or 8 months ago. Do you think they're going to put a vax passport for domestic flights? And I said, probably not, but I would never be surprised at what the government does. But I think, and at that time I said, I think they're going to start easing up on some of this stuff, like in the spring, summer of 22, because the midterm elections are coming. So I think it's like I knew something like this was going to happen, and most libertarians could have called it too, that the COVID stuff is kind of, people are tired of it. They're starting to walk some of it back, except in, big urban centers. And then at the same time that's happening, we have to go send our military somewhere. We didn't get a war during Trump, so we have to get one. It's almost,
the timing is awfully suspicious, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we have this new hobgoblin. And I saw CBS News tweet out that blaming the Ukraine crisis on inflation on the Ukraine crisis or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
As if our lives suck and everything's more expensive because there's a crisis over there.
Yeah, because the beef that now costs twice what it did here in Tennessee, that comes from Ukraine.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And so there, I mean, it's almost laughable, right? And people are seeing through this stuff. But
that's
it is struggling.
That's what I wanted to get to, is I heard that apparently the last election, and you might want to explain a little bit how elections happen up there. Somebody said, I think Trudeau had his party had just about a third of the vote.
Mm-hmm.
And then formed a coalition, but that a recent poll after this Emergencies Act was put in, that his approval rating is down in the teens somewhere. So you think he's gonna, are you surprised that well, I've kind of asked that before, but I'm a little surprised that things have turned south for him there. But what do you attribute that to, and where do you think Canadian politics is going to go because of this?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you, some of my progressive friends, they are very disgusted by Trudeau's leadership in all this, right? Like, he disappeared. He was gone off the face of the planet while this was going on. He used all this hyperbolic rhetoric to try to trump up division among the population. And so even the progressives are sick of this. And Trudeau was never a darling of most progressive voters anyways. The people that voted for the Liberal Party were people that that consumed American media and thought that conservatives were like evil and white supremacists, and it scared them shitless to think that a conservative might win. And so most people in Canada, I've noticed, during my years running as a libertarian, they vote against their worst fear rather than for their highest value. I think that's a kind of a byproduct of maybe the first past the post system. But I had an army of social conservatives going door to door for me the last time I ran, and all of them called me on the eve of the election and said, "Sorry, Tim, we love you. We want to vote for you, but we have to hold our nose and vote for this liberal conservative guy because we can't risk Trudeau winning the election." And so that happens regularly. So Trudeau has never really enjoyed a lot of popularity, I would say, among most Canadians. He was looked at as a safe place to park your vote because he wasn't one of the other guys. He wasn't as nutty as the NDP. He wasn't as evil as the Conservatives. And, we can't risk the Conservatives or NDP in power, so we'll vote Liberal. Yeah. So that's how he ended up, and again, in Canada, one of the differences, we don't vote directly for our prime minister. He's not on the ballot except in his own home riding. So it's the leader of the party that gets the most seats that generally becomes prime minister. And technically, our queen chooses who the prime minister is through the governor general in Canada, who's appointed by the queen and the emissary of the queen. But it's almost always the leader of the party that gets the most seats. So that's why Trudeau's the prime minister. And yes, this has definitely soured them against him. I mean, the other thing that happened during this trucker convoy is that Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the Conservative Party, got ousted as leader by his own caucus. They're like, you've been a feckless leader. You haven't opposed this. I mean, Aaron O'Toole at the beginning of this pandemic said, we need to put Canada on a war footing to deal with this pandemic. In other words, we need to use the War Measures Act or the Emergencies Act, the very act that Trudeau brought in. So conservatives are like, you are feckless and weak and you continually flip-flop, and we're going to get rid of you. So that was another fringe benefit of the trucker convoy, was that they got rid of this feckless opposition leader. And now we have a chance to get someone that will more represent their interests in there, a stronger voice. And the front runner right now is a guy named Pierre Poilievre, who is very good in terms of being a finance critic. He is, dare I say, maybe even Austrian leaning in his economics. He's been pretty quiet on social issues and different things like that, but he's had some gold, almost Rand Paul type moments in the House of Commons, holding people to the fire financially and economically. And, we're heading down a dark path economically right now. So I suspect people are looking at the Conservatives. The Conservative Party is now well ahead of the rest of the pack in terms of popularity, whereas before this convoy they were lagging behind, and the Liberals are now the ones lagging behind, and the Conservatives are out in front. And I think that's largely because this guy Pierre Poilievre is speaking about the economy, and seems to be able to identify what's causing inflation, and therefore people are looking at him as, the economy is the thing that's troubling us the most right now. We see the prices, and so I think that's why Trudeau now is another reason why he's losing popularity really quickly.
I'm actually not surprised a little bit about Trudeau. I try to generally avoid television news, and so up until 3 or 4 days ago, I had actually never heard Justin Trudeau speak. I'd always just seen pictures and read stories, if that. And I was just amazed at how condescending and weird he sounded.
He's so condescending, so sanctimonious. It's so off-putting to most people.
He's not even good. Somebody like Bill Clinton is the classic, oh, I can see how he puts that across. But people say that about Obama too, but I always thought Obama was super condescending too. But
look, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. I was
just going to say Trudeau he was born into privilege. There's a good chance Fidel Castro was his father, because his family was in Cuba at the same time. his mom got pregnant, and they were known swingers, and they were, so was Castro, and the facial similarities are striking. Let's just say that.
Yep.
He was born into privilege. He's a trust fund kid. He's just essentially a perpetual frat boy living his best life.
Yep.
He's not in charge of Canada. He's not calling the shots. He's playing a part. He was a drama teacher before he was prime minister. And, he knows what will get him applause and adulation in those progressive circles. And that's going up to people and touching their nose and, I care about you and I care about people. And, like damn misogyny and feminism, rah, rah. And, he knows exactly how to play the part. He's no mastermind. He's no, and again,
he is a master of disguise, though. You've seen
he's a master of disguise. Oh yeah, he's definitely a master of disguise. I mean, the amount of costumes that kid's put on over his lifetime is stunning. It's like in Canada we have this children's show called Mr. Dress Up, where every day he open up the tickle trunk and put on a different costume. Well, Justin Trudeau watched a little too much Mr. Dress Up, I think, growing up, and he's been, he loves to get dressed up. He loves the attention on him. He loves being seen as virtuous and a savior. And, but it's so easy to see through all that for most Canadians. It's just that most Canadians look at the rest of the political field and kind of hold their nose and vote Trudeau.
Yep. I've actually been encouraged by England specifically, not the UK. I'm sad to say, I'm a quarter Scottish and 3/4 English, and Scotland is just a socialist nightmare as far as their government goes and their COVID policies. But England, I think, has, I think as of the last week or two, they've basically gotten rid of all, national level COVID restrictions. They're not doing the passport even for people coming in to England, which, London is obviously one of the biggest, there's millions of people come there every year. And so they're wanting to keep business open. And I've heard some other people on podcasts saying that, the English middle class and working class are kind of have this conservative libertarian streak and kind of opposition to the government, almost a little more muscular than some here in the States. Is there any of that going on in Canada too, that we might be surprised of? And I wanted to tie that into, I think that was part of the reason Brexit succeeded, was there must be this strain of something that, people are proud to be English. They don't want to be ruled by Brussels. Their businesses are getting crushed by, taxes and all that. Is there any of that in Canada? And is there any movement toward any type of political decentralization there? Obviously, Quebec tried to do this 30 years ago or so, and they came really close. So there's a precedent almost for it in Canada. So is there, what's going on with that?
Yeah, there definitely is a growing robustness among kind of libertarian-minded people, I would say, and I wouldn't even know to call them libertarian, but they're anti-establishment, let's say. Most people here in Canada, like, we don't have the same libertarian genetics that the US has, where, your country was basically formed when a bunch of libertarians killed a bunch of conservatives and started your own country. It's in your mythos, it's in your blood, it's in your DNA. It's kind of taught as part of your whole national mythos, right? In Canada, we don't have anything like that. And so most of it is just people who are fed up with the establishment. I mean, Justin Trudeau and the establishment have done more to create libertarians than I could have ever hoped to, as banging my head against the wall as Libertarian Party leader. So the other thing I'll say is that because some people have had the courage to speak out against this when it wasn't popular, it's paved the way or created a safer environment, I'd say, for people who secretly harbor our views to be open. My wife is an ER nurse, and she tells me about this ER doc who who whispers in her ear all the time, like, what do you think about these masks? This is kind of bullshit, isn't it? Like, and he's like clearly anti-establishment, and he's quietly talking to people that he identifies as sharing his views. And we see that happening all over the place now. And that's only been in the last 6 months where I've actually seen that shift. Like right now, I stepped down in August as a Libertarian Party leader because, you know, I spent my retirement savings running for prime minister. I don't have another retirement savings to cash in. I just didn't have the time to focus on it. So I'm focusing on work now with my fire department. And we had a healthcare mandate come in from our provincial, you know, in Canada, it's universal healthcare. We have the province is in charge of healthcare, and we contract ambulance services to them. And so they impose this vaccine mandate on all healthcare workers, including all our firefighters that I work with. And so, you know, I'm vaccinated. It wasn't an issue for me, but I found out there's a few guys that weren't vaccinated for religious reasons and other reasons, and they were holding the line. They weren't going to get vaccinated under any circumstances. They were willing to lose their job. So I started an organization to help out firefighters across this province and eventually across the country, and healthcare workers push back against these vax mandates. Now, when I started this, I wasn't a very popular guy necessarily at work. A lot of my colleagues were looking at me like, geez, this isn't safe. And I don't know what to think. Like, are you really an anti-vax nutter and this sort of thing? And I was very clear. Look, I'm personally, I'm pro-vaccine. I don't have an issue with this vaccine. Definitely now, I don't think it worked as well as it was advertised. I got COVID pretty bad despite being fully vaccinated. So, you know, I think we were sold a false bill of goods. But, you know, I said, look, I'm pro-vaccine, but do you think these guys should be fired? I mean, they're willing to get tested before coming to work. They're going to be safer than you and I are. And over a few months, you know, of just being reasonable like that and standing up and having courage, despite the lack of popularity, the culture around work shifted. The culture in Alberta shifted, you know, and we actually got our health minister in Alberta. We started a campaign to get these healthcare workers back to work, and the healthcare, it wasn't our provincial health authority that brought them back to work. It was our politician, the health minister, that said, you will bring these people back to work if they're willing to test. And so we got an order from our government because of this popular movement we were able to create by just being reasonable, by getting out there and being active and speaking and doing videos and doing media interviews and different things like that. So there has been a palpable shift over the last 6 months. And in part, it's, you know, the environment that's created that is also Omicron, right? Where everyone who's vaccinated is getting sick anyways, and they're spreading it around anyways. And it's like, okay, none of these things are working. Like, why are we doing all these things? So all these things kind of lined up. And I think now we have a big swath of the public, much bigger than before, that are very libertarian minded, libertarian leaning. They don't trust the establishment. They might not be able to put a finger on their philosophy. This is a ripe time for them to be exposed to our philosophy. But it's never been a better time to promote liberty and than right now. And so it's a great time, I think. Well, you know, yeah,
I would think that maybe the decentralization message would work with that. And I was going to bring up, you brought up the fact that the socialized medicine, even though everyone in Canada has it, it's administered by the provinces, right?
Yes.
So explain, does the tax money go to Ottawa and then come back to the provincial capitals? Or in other words, I'm thinking, is that the fact that Canadians who do love their healthcare, socialized healthcare, you can ask any pollster, the fact that is it set up in such a way that somebody in Alberta could vote for an independent Alberta or an independent Midwestern Canada without having to be afraid that the healthcare system is going to be upended?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a real challenge, and it's something I think there's a big thirst for as well. You know, I work for a municipality, a county, for a fire department. Okay. And we before 2009, we were in charge of ambulance services, of EMS. So we were an integrated department. If it was a fire came in, we'd hop on a fire truck. If an ambulance call came in, we'd hop. It was a very good model, very dynamic, locally controlled. When the province took it over, it removed our ability to do those types of things. And so our union, our employees, our county would love to have control back over this service, because what happens is our ambulance gets sucked out of this suburban community and gets sucked into the big city, and we do calls in the big city all night when we should be doing calls in our own community. But if you have a giant centralized system, it makes sense to send ambulances where the calls are, but we don't want a big centralized system for that reason, right? So there is a definite need for it, and there's actually a growing political movement here in Alberta to decentralize things, both from a municipal level, a firefighter union level. We have our premier is on the verge of losing his job under a leadership review, and his replacement wants to decentralize AHS. Now, part of the problem that you identified is that while it's managed by the province, it's actually a federal mandate that somewhat controls it. So we pay federal and provincial income tax, and the federal government issues health care transfers to the province. So Alberta might get several $billion to put into their healthcare system, but they have to be compliant with the Canada Health Act. And the Canada Health Act says the province must be the sole proprietor of healthcare. In other words, you can't have any private options. Old Tim here can't start a community paramedic business looking after seniors in my community, or even a charity, because that wouldn't be controlled by, and if you allow that to happen, you won't get these billions of dollars in health transfers. So it's like a bribe to make sure there's no private health care in. So, what we have to do now is pragmatically, if we're looking pragmatically at what we can do right now, it's like, how do we influence provincial politics so that the provinces, we don't violate that the province is the sole proprietor, but that we decentralize it so that maybe there's regional health boards or something like that. Ultimately, the long-term goal, of course, is to go our own way, but that might require secession. Now, on the secession front, there is a growing secessionist movement in Alberta and some of the provinces, because we're just tired of being controlled by what we call the Laurentian elite, the lower Canada, Ottawa people who are almost always progressive and almost always look down their nose at Alberta as a bunch of hicks who know nothing but have all the resources. And, so that there's this constant battle between them sucking up our tax money while at the same time preventing us from getting our oil to market, for example. And so they're parasites and prohibitionists all, and so they're the worst. And Albertans get tired of it. And so there is a growing move for independence here in Alberta. It's a little bit different than Quebec independence. Quebec independence is sort of an aspirational independence. It's like it's all centered around their culture and their francophone language and everything like that. Whereas in Alberta, it's just absolute hatred towards the Laurentian elite, and everyone, we don't share necessarily the same culture or philosophy or anything like that. So it's more centered around just wanting to go our own separate way that way. But
yeah, I mean, and that, to me, that's civilized to say, hey, on these things, we don't want to be together anymore, but we'll still sell you our oil and our beef, and you can still sell us, your media or whatever. So I hope that, I really hope that grows, and I think it is growing around the world. And I think that's one of the things behind the Great Reset is that's a centralization plot if I've ever heard it. And so I think they're wanting to try and lock this stuff down before, I think Brexit was a wake up call for the international financial class. And I think kind of the reaction to COVID is kind of that too. So we have a lot of work to do as libertarians. Just before we wrap up, how's the convoy? What's up with that now? Or have they dispersed? Did they get any concessions? Is it all in the provinces that change is happening? Where is it as of Thursday, the 24th?
Yeah, well, I would say that it was largely successful. I mean, we got many of the provinces to repeal many of their mandates. It's not perfect. There's still federal mandates, and we still need to be vaccinated to fly, to go across borders and different things like that. But they started something, and I think that's going to continue to grow, and people are getting sick of all the COVID regime requirements. Even, my vaccinated friends who are traveling now having to test all the time. And
wait, even though they're vaccinated, they have to test?
Yes. Yeah. If we go to Mexico or something like that, we have to test before we can board a plane to come back.
Right.
So those kinds of things are still in place. And, even my friends who are pro-vax are like, I tested positive when I was down there. It extended my trip by like 10 days. They're getting financially hit because of this regime, and they're testing positive because they had COVID like a month before traveling. And so they're still testing positive or whatever, so none of this makes any sense. Another family I know, mom and dad got tested positive for COVID, but the kids were fine. So they had to send the kids alone home from Costa Rica, meet their grandparents at the airport, while mom and dad quarantined in Costa Rica for another 3 weeks or something like that. So, people are seeing now where the rubber hits the road, as most normal people are just trying to live their lives from the before time, then the long ago, where they take their vacations and they travel around and they're just sick of all the bullshit, right? So I think the trend is going in the right direction. Now, the convoy protesters, I hear a lot of them are still camped out around Ottawa, trying to figure out what their next move is, how they're going to regroup. Some of them are like wanting to keep the pressure on until everything's gone. So it remains to be seen whether they can get things going again. But I think the fact that some of the organizers have been just brutally treated by the state, and Tamara Leach is still in prison. She couldn't make bail. Meanwhile, there was an Antifa protester that ran over 2 or 3 people at one of these protests in Winnipeg, and he made bail. And we never even heard about it on the news. The mainstream media didn't even pick up the fact that there was this deranged terrorist that tried to take out peaceful protesters. So but that sort of treatment by the state has definitely put a dampen, I think, on the convoy. But I'm not sure that they need to necessarily regroup, because they've really got things moving in the right direction. And it might not, there might not be any advantage to regrouping and keeping the protests going, because most people are opposed to these measures now. And so they've done their job, and the governments are starting to listen. So,
are there any, I know that it's different than in the States. The elections aren't set at certain times. Is there going to be a federal level election or any provincial things? Do you see that happening anytime soon? And explain, will the LP play a part in that? I know there's these other parties that you mentioned. Where do you think, how soon might Canadians vote on this, and what sort of realignments and party formations might happen?
Right. Well, it's hard to say. I mean, anytime there's a minority government where your sitting party has less than 50% of the House, there's always a chance. Most of the time, minority governments only last a couple years. Now, Trudeau just called an election, and he called it early last fall, and he got a minority government. I think he thought he was going to cruise to a majority government, and that's why he called it, I think, a year or two early. Didn't work for him, and now he's even more tenuous. So what I think it would take is the other parties getting together and saying, let's force an election, and forming a coalition to force an election. Otherwise, it's, we have to, there's a drop dead deadline in 4 years from last fall, that they're going to have an election. So, I hope that there isn't an election right away. We need to see the Conservative Party get a leader. We need to see that leader make some waves. I'd like to see the Libertarian Party, now that they have a leader who can do it full time, whereas I couldn't. I hope they can start making some headway. But we have this populist party called the PPC, the People's Party of Canada, who has a lot of overlapping views with us, and the leader of that party, Maxime Bernier, has been very active and has been out there pushing back against this regime. So he's gained some popularity. Now, I suspect that a lot of his supporters, if Pierre Poilievre wins a leadership election, they'll jump ship and go back to the Conservatives. because their primary goal is to get rid of Trudeau at this point, not necessarily vote for Maxime or something like that. So, it's going to be difficult for the Libertarian Party to break through a lot of the noise. The PPC makes a lot of libertarian sounding noises. They're not they're not ultimately libertarians. Their foreign policy is suspect. They're not, they favor the drug war, different things like that. They don't have the same anti-state view that us hardcore libertarians have. So there's always going to be a need for the Libertarian Party. And, different strategies as well, right? The PPC is trying to pick up votes so they're tailoring their message to try and get votes. Whereas what we're trying to do is shift culture and introduce these ideas to people. And we see it as an educational enterprise. We don't think government's going to change, even if we were to adopt a strategy that got us elected. I don't imagine we'd be able to do much better than the current parties. Maybe on the margins, we'd make some improvements, but those would be wiped away as soon as we lost our seat to the statist party. So what we really need to focus on is creating a cultural wave in Canada and feeding into what's already building right now, which is an anti-establishment culture. And we just need to give it some depth and some root and connect it to libertarian philosophy. And so I think I'm interested to see what the Libertarian Party can do over the next little while. And I'm also really excited to see what's happening down south, with the rise of Dave Smith and the Mises Caucus and Michael Heiss and, Tom Woods and all these people pushing hard, and Angela McArdle doing some great things down there. I think they're really going to do a great work at popularizing the libertarian message. And if our new leader's smart, he will attach himself to what's going on down south and leverage it and say, this is what we represent here in Canada.
Well, thanks for the kind words about us. And actually, several months ago, I'm usually the person who sends out the emails for the caucus, and we got one or two people saying, "Hey, can I join from Canada?" And
right,
federal election laws are like, you can't give us money and stuff like that. But I basically said, "Hey, just start your own Mises Caucus up there."
Absolutely.
So I really want to, because I think Canada is maybe even more prime than the States in some ways for that decentralization. If you can convince the do they still call it Bloc Québécois? Is that their they still have that?
Yeah.
So
Bloc
if you can
Québécois.
convince those guys to do that, and some of the guys in the West, maybe you could do that. But I think that decentralization is the way to go. I don't think we're ever going to convince we're not going to cut the head off of the snake, right? We're never going to convince the media and academia and the political and banking class that, Murray Rothbard was right. So I think we have to just try to hamper their power to do things. And I really appreciate, I didn't know that you said you'd spent quite a bit of money on running, and I just say thanks to being, there's so many libertarians who do things like that. I haven't heard of anybody doing quite that much. So that's impressive. Thanks for doing something big to spread the message up there. It's been a pleasure talking to you again.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate that. And yeah, if there are Mises Caucus supporters from Canada, join the Libertarian Party. It's very easy to influence the Libertarian Party. Look, we were essentially a Mises Libertarian Party when I was a leader. I pretty much agreed with everything the Mises Caucus stands for, and I was trying to push it, but I just didn't have time to. I'm not a Michael Heiss, right? I was during the 2015 election, and that was our best year ever in our history, because I was able to cash in my retirement and take a year off work and devote the entire year to running hard. And we need that kind of energy. And so if you're a guy that's got a lot of energy, sign up. There's no shortage of influential spots to fill, and you can get on the board, and you can, it's not like the US where we're fighting these battles with each other. The battle we're fighting is we need some volunteers. We need to fill these seats. So whoever shows up basically runs the party. So just show up, Mises guys, and you can very easily, and our new leader, Jacques Boudreau, great guy, very much Austrian minded in terms of economics. he's very open to, the Mises caucus message. I'm sure he would be right in line with what you guys are doing as well. So.
All right. Yeah, I'll look him up. And like I say, thanks for your time. And hopefully in a couple of years, we can all look back on this and, hey, did that really happen?
Yeah.
All right. See you, Tim.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
so much. Appreciate it, Aaron.
And there you have it. I'd like to thank Tim Moen for his time and wisdom. And again, my apologies for the fact that world events kind of got in the way of making this a timely episode. But I hope that the Misesian libertarians up in Canada will follow Tim's example and stay active in the party. And to the extent we're legally allowed to ally with the LP here in the U.S. and hopefully make some headway over the next few years, as I think some people are ready to hear the message. Some links to resources about things we talked about, including the LP there in Canada. You can find that at the show notes page, decentralizedrevolution.com/74. Thanks to Dave vs. Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution. And of course, and I really mean this, if you haven't done it, please consider subscribing to our email list or giving to Mises PAC at takehumanaction.com. And of course, thanks to everyone who shares, rates, reviews, and subscribes to Decentralized Revolution. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.